Welcome to the St. Louis Regional Freightways Freight Week STL 2020 panel discussion. We have two topics for this session. The first will include a creative approach by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the Kaskaskia Regional Port District that extended the barge industry's operations during the historic flooding of 2019. And the second topic will include a discussion with the outgoing Coast Guard Captain Scott Stormer, Sector Commander of the Upper Mississippi River, and the incoming Commander, Mick Scott, Deputy Commander. This panel discussion is one of several that are part of Freight Week STL 2020 using our virtual format. This is our third year of Freight Week, where we're working together with industry leaders to support the freight industry, innovation, and we thank our four panelists for their participation today. We're going to start the discussion with Ed Baker. He's the General Manager of the Kaskaskia Regional Port District. He has been in this position since September 2011. KRPD represents the nation's 10th largest inland port and has operations in 3 counties in southwestern Illinois. We also have Courtney Wilson, the Assistant Operations Manager of the Kaskaskia River Project and the Jerry F. Costello Lock and Dam with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. She has been with the Corps of Engineers for 19 years and has managed the Kaskaskia River Project since 2016. So first I need to set the stage. The Kaskaskia River is a critical transportation link for scrubber stone and coiled steel, and they're traveling inbound, grain and slag traveling outbound, moving about 1.5 million tons per year. Last year, during the record flooding, the focus of the collaboration between Kaskaskia Regional Port District and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was keeping the lock open for as many days as possible to continue with the freight movement. So Ed, we're going to turn this over to you and have you and Courtney tell us about those collaborative efforts. I am going to ask that maybe you could tell our audience about the relationship you had with the Corps of Engineers prior to the summer that allowed the two of you and your agencies to work together.
Well, the Kaskaskia Port District has been around for 55 years, and we are a partnership between the Corps of Engineers and the Department of Natural Resources. This partnership, we meet annually, well, on a more formal basis annually, but we do meet regularly throughout the year to talk about issues and needs within the river. The Corps manages and operates the Lock and Dam and maintains the channel on the Kaskaskia River up to Fayetteville. The DNR manages the land resources, and the Port District works with customers and developers to put cargo on the river and works on our terminals. So that's a three-way partnership that we have. So I do business, Corps does navigation, and DNR does land management. Well, over the years, we've worked together on many different things, whether it be trying to maintain the lock and dam during the lean years on the Kaskaskia River when we were down to less than 500,000 tons a year, to now to where we are today, 1.5 million, but we see that increasing hopefully in the next year to maybe doubling that number. We got some great things happening upstream that we should be able to do that without too much difficulty. And we've been working with the Corps on those various things to make sure that the river is reliable. And one of the things we have to do to our customers, to our people who use the river to bring cargo in and out, is make sure that river is reliable, sustainable. And flooding, of which we've seen more so in the last few years.
Yes, plenty.
What's that?
I said plenty.
It seems like since I've been here, every other year for sure, and sometimes twice a year, and that's not good. Prior to my tenure, we didn't have those kind of floods. So there's something going on, we don't know what it is. So the industry gets nervous when we have to shut down that river. And some days, for some floods, and Courtney will talk a little bit about this too, they come up and they go down fast. So most of our customers have a supply chain that allows some disruption, not long, but some, let's say 5 days. And after that, they start getting a little nervous and they want to know, can we operate the lock and dam higher? What's our limitation? And so when we, a couple of years ago, when we had a flood, the Corps started to do a little bit of testing out the idea of, can we operate a little higher than normal with that lock and still be sustainable? And when this last year's flood. In fact, last year at this time, we would have been in a closure mode in our longest closure. Corps reevaluated what they were doing, and I'm going to let Courtney then talk about that because it was significant. And we'll get into the details of the first part of the flood, the second part of the flood too. So Courtney, why don't you talk a little bit about what the Corps planned to do and how we were going to meet that challenge that we had before us.
Sure. So as Ed mentioned, people have a supply stock for, 5 days perhaps. And in this situation, we ended up being closed for 87 days. And we'll touch on some of those numbers in a bit. But so 87 days, people are really under pressure, that causes more trucks to run and be on the road. It's additional cost for everybody. Ed's phone is ringing off the hook, asking what can be done. So Ed approached us originally, and I thought, well, it's an interesting challenge. We had discussed it a bit after the winter of 2016 flood. And we had actually, with some of the funding that we received after that flood, pushed ahead and had an analysis done on, is it feasible to raise the lock arms? So we had a little bit of information behind us already. So when Ed came and asked, my operations manager is Bob Wilkins. He manages the Carlisle Lake to our north, and then also the Kaskaskia River project. So Bob and I sat down and started looking at things. We consulted with our engineering staff. Is there a reason mechanically we can't operate it at higher levels? The big push, and something that I think is very important, I then went to my staff and said, is there a way we can do this safely? Because those are the folks that are going to be in the recess with moving, operating machinery. They're in flood water. It's the middle of summer. Unfortunately, a lot of snakes like to hang out in those, crevices. So yeah, they're the people doing the work. So we sat down and talked about it, and it was decided that if we take our time, we had spotters, it could be done safely. And so at that time, we made the decision that we would go ahead, we'd give it a try. And, I'm happy to say that it did work out for us. And it went so well that it's something that we will consider in future events as well.
I think in talking about what the limitation was is when the river comes up to a certain level, there's a lock arm mechanism at the gates that creates a recess that could collect debris. And if debris gets in that recess, and we have a graphic on this, so I think they're going to show that later.
Okay.
In that recess, it could damage the lock, and then we're totally out of business. So there's an elevation that they have to stay below in order to keep that lock arm operational. So why don't you go into a little more
Sure.
that graphic and talk about what you did as far as the difference in elevations and work
Sure.
on that.
So historically, we've shut the lockdown when we got to elevation 80.5. And that's right when the water starts going into the recesses, which is where our main sector gear is located that operates the gate. That's where our cylinders are located to operate the gate. And like Ed said, the reason for that is we don't want any debris getting in there. The flashier, faster floods tend to bring a lot of debris. It brings it quick, and it's really large stuff. You can have entire trees, refrigerators, who knows what's going to come down. So you don't want that getting caught in your equipment, obviously. So what we looked at this time, actually, although it wasn't ideal, the longevity of this flood played into helping us make our decision, because the river didn't rise and fall quickly. In fact, it seemed like it took forever. We were raising 1/100th of a foot a day in some cases. So the fact that it wasn't carrying a large debris load with it allowed us to get in there and manage that debris load, in an easier manner. So from 80.5, we were able to operate to elevation 82.5. And so you may think to yourself, well, big deal. Well, that's a big few feet when it comes to industry and moving barges through. So The water does actually come up around the gears, around the machinery. And to give you a little, once we put the graphic up here in a bit, you'll see the top of our lock wall is elevation 385. So the water is actually going over the lock at elevation 385. So 2.5 feet is what we're away from being over the wall. So it takes a lot of effort from our folks. It takes effort from industry. Our towing company actually sent their superintendent down. He's on site while we're moving the boats through. But that's what we're looking at. In the future, if we get the opportunity to raise the miter gate machinery, it would be located on top of the lock walls and would go approximately 0.4 feet higher, 0.4 higher than what we operated under this flood condition.
A lot of people on the industry side look at Chester's gauge on the Mississippi River as a way to say, okay, how's the Kaskaskia doing? And Chester gauge, if it's at 32 or 34, that's what, a high flood, that's when things start shutting down. And we would have been shut down at 30, I think 32. So the industry was asking me, can we get to Chester at 34? And so the numbers equate to that 380, 82.5 if we're at 34. So that was significant. And we have another calendar that shows the lockage closure time frame. And again, as Courtney mentioned, floods are unique and they operate differently. Some are fast up, slow down. Some are slow down up and fast down. And in this situation, the Corps did not implement the new strategy in the up part of the flood, the very first part of the flood. And that's when we start having our discussions. How do we keep this lock open? And so we were closed 21 days at the very beginning part of the season. Now, had they not implemented that new policy at the end of that, as the water's coming down, we would have been closed 32 days, or close to 32 days. But there was 11 days they saved off that front end. Okay, or the other way to look at it too, we actually had 2 floods last year. We had a rise, fall, and then another rise and fall. Right. The second one was worse. There was a period of time that they would have been open 8 days that allowed them to move without any new policy. But because of that new policy, they added 11 days to that opening. And that allowed them to move cargo, scrubber stone, to a power plant that requires it for air quality. And if they don't get that movement, it's critical. That power plant can't operate under federal law. So that's a critical movement. And the alternative is trucking it. And trucking it is very expensive when you're talking about the distances they have to go and getting the product to that location. And when you're in flood stage, it's even worse. So we closed again the lock and dam on May 3rd. We actually saved another day right there. And we were closed 66 days after that. And so now what are you doing when we say the industry can handle about a 6-day closure and we're not closed at 66? We would have been closed for 71 days had it not implemented that policy at the end of that new policy. So again, those extra days cut off at the end really helped us get industry back up and running again. I believe the power plant told me they spent over $1 million extra just in shipping that product to the plant because they couldn't do it by barge. So that was what the Corps did was so special, was so unique that we really appreciate it.
Courtney, looking into the future, if you have similar flooding levels, will you be able to use the same strategy that you used last summer, or is there any permanent fixes that would allow you to continue to extend the transportation of those vessels?
Sure. So I would say, yes, we will definitely look at this as a new operating procedure for the lock. It is almost in these flooding situations, not just an event by event determination. It's almost a lockage by lockage determination. I will say that everyone down there works very well together. I mentioned the transfer company that primarily runs through the lock on a daily basis. Everyone is in agreement that we're not going to push anything that isn't safe, whether that's to our employees or whether it's to our infrastructure, whatever it may be. But this is something that we will continue to use. It worked out very well. The long-term look that I mentioned before was that analysis on the lock arms. So it would be a replacement of our strut arms and the machinery up out of those recesses. And, currently they're over 40 years old. So they've lived a life. Everything is still in good working order. However, I'd like to get us in position for the future, where our equipment's working well. We just continue to become more reliable. And if we can kill two birds with one stone and operate at a higher level, I think everybody wins on that one.
No, that's critical because it brings certainty to the industry about when we have these high water events that they can operate at that higher level. And having a permanent fix takes the element of staffing and other things out of the mixture. So we can do it, without any policy changes. It can become standard routine. We don't know what the future managers of the Corps would do under limited staffing, let's say. They could say, we just don't have the staff resources to do that during a high water event. We're fortunate to have that cooperation today. By having that modification permanently put in, that would be significant. And it then demonstrates to the industry too that we're here to really respond to those issues. It's $1.5 million, a lot of money, but on the big scheme of things, that $1.5 million would have saved itself, in that last flood easily. They were thrilled. The industry was thrilled between the various customers when they heard that they can operate longer and go through that higher elevation. And it was just a win-win all the way around for everybody. So,
Ed, talk about that with the industry. You mentioned that the power plant, they had incurred additional costs for trucking when the river shut down. Did you get any phone calls? How did you communicate that with the barge and fleeting industry? Because again, there's a certain dollar amount that they lose every day when the river shut down.
Right. I would do emails to them to let them know, hey, we're at this level. We're trying to work with the Corps to make sure that we can open up sooner. I think just that communication back and forth was helpful. I know our towing company was also communication with the Lock and Dam. We had another customer who brings steel in from Arkansas by barge. And each barge load has 80 coils of steel on it. And they were stacked up on the Mississippi River. And actually told the company, don't even ship them to us. We can't take them. And how soon will the river open so we can then start telling that company to start shipping those barge loads of steel, coil steel, to us? So every time I'd call them, I'd say, this is the projection. We can't guarantee what nature's going to do as far as how fast it's going to go down and meet that higher level elevation that we can operate under. But here's our projection. And they were really appreciative of that communication and the fact that the Corps was willing to work and have their staff. I mean, it takes physical effort. You have to have 4 people manning those lock arms with fire hoses in order to flush out any debris. And so it's additional staff at various times a day that it would occur.
My entire staff at the Lock and Dam, I have 9 folks. So 4 people may not seem like a lot unless you're only working with 9 folks on site. And one of them have, 1 or 2 have to be there overnight shifts. So that takes away from your numbers for working day shifts and getting the mission accomplished. So it really does take a higher effort of labor when we're doing it. So just to put that into perspective, folks are here.
Let's add COVID to it this year. And we're in high water events right now. Should we go to flood stage? She has to have her staff at split schedules because of the COVID issue. And would you have the staff resources to do that? I don't know. We haven't had that conversation yet.
On behalf of the industry, we want to thank Courtney and Ed for the two of you guys working collaborating together. During that record duration of flooding last year, there wasn't a lot of positive things that were being mentioned, and this was kind of behind the scenes. And so you guys did a fantastic job. And obviously, we appreciate Ed's efforts to communicate with the industry. Obviously, they were interested in the information, but I also think that was very much appreciated from the industry, knowing that the two of you had that relationship and working collectively together. And I think that's one of those stories that when you're working with public agencies and federal agencies, we don't always put a great emphasis on that. So that's where we think you did a fantastic job with that, because obviously safety was of concern, but the other thing is from an economic perspective, helping the barge industry was just fantastic. So we're very appreciative of that. Last question I've got is Courtney. Ed mentioned it as far as COVID-19. Any comments that you would like to share regarding your operations or the industry, or anything you'd like to share with the industry along those lines?
Sure. I know as everyone is experiencing, there's a number of things in our daily life that are closed or shut down right now. But I am happy to report that there has been no disruption to service at the lock to the navigation industry. So that becomes absolute critical mission is to keep the lock open. So we have, I've made some changes at the lock to scheduling. We have split schedules going on in the event we were to come in contact with it or an operator on duty. We have operators in reserve that we can bring in. The district as a whole, the St. Louis district has really put a lot of effort into planning, putting SOPs in places. If something would occur, where do we move? You got to think through all the steps. What's our plan B? Where would we operate from? So all that has been put in place. My staff has been great to work with. They really, they haven't fought it. They've really done a good job because they see the importance of keeping the lock open and reliable. We have had 2 cases where employees had to, they voluntarily self-quarantined because they didn't want to risk the rest of the staff. And so I certainly appreciate that. But that is the mission. And as of right now, everything is running well.
All right, that's excellent. All right, we're going to change gears and we're going to turn to the U.S. Coast Guard. We're going to start with Captain Scott Stormer. Congratulations on your outstanding career with the U.S. Coast Guard, which has culminated with your most recent responsibilities as Sector Commander of the Mississippi River. You started this position in 2017 and have been responsible for all or parts of 11 states and over 2,200 miles of waterways on the upper Mississippi, Missouri, and Illinois rivers. You recently announced you were retiring from the Coast Guard effective this spring. And we thought before your departure, you could share with us your perspective with freight in mind, how the inland waterway plays a role in the nation's supply chain. Can you tell us a little bit about that and the amount of commerce that it supports?
Sure, Mary. Thanks very much for the opportunity again to participate on the panel. Ed and Courtney, thanks. I'm going to highlight something here in a little bit that this panel really speaks to, is the fact that we're focused on shared governance and that kind of shared perspective, and the opportunity to meet what we know are shared objectives for the waterway is really embodied in this panel here, with the community, the port community represented, the federal government represented, industry represented. So thanks again for the opportunity to participate today, and look forward to some additional questions. From a freight perspective, the inland waterway, I have grown to love it in my time here in St. Louis. In total, I've been here now about 8 years, which is pretty long in the tooth for a coastie to be in the same location. Didn't know anything about the inland transportation system and the inland marine environment before I arrived in St. Louis in 2010, and have really just come to appreciate everything that the inland maritime industry and the expanded community around that industry offers, not only the region, but the nation. You mentioned some of the numbers: 2,200 miles of river, commercially navigable river north of St. Louis, between the Missouri, the Illinois, and the upper Mississippi River. That translates into tens of billions of dollars of contribution to the economic engine for the larger marine transportation system across the nation, which which totals, as many as 25,000 miles of navigable channel, 360 ports across the United States, and more than $5 trillion of economic value towards the overall, economic and global numbers for the entire nation. That translates in easy numbers. That's economic numbers. Those are dollars, but that also translates to national security. And I think we saw some of that play out during the flood of last year in terms of the impact of the closure of portions of the river for such an extended period of time. I think we're seeing that now with regard to some of the security, national security and economic impacts of these partial shutdowns and partial closures related to COVID and some of the restrictions that have been put in place in the short term. So from a freight perspective and a commerce perspective, we're really focused on the opportunity to keep things moving as safely, securely, and efficiently as we can, no matter what the circumstances are that the world is throwing at us.
All right, so let's talk about, so how do you do that as it relates to freight? I guess the question is, what are the load-bearing walls that you're doing to help support that from the Coast Guard's role?
Sure, it's a really great question. This is where I want to talk about that shared governance. The biggest load-bearing wall, to use your phrase, from the Coast Guard's perspective, is really the collaborative approach, or a collaborative approach, to keeping the system as safe, secure, and efficient as possible. And we use kind of that shared governance model, or that shared governance perspective and approach, that everyone involved, from the federal government, the Coast Guard, the Army Corps of Engineers, the state governments, the port communities, the maritime industry, the public writ large, recreational boating, as another example, have a role in the governance of the waterway. It's unlike other modes of transportation up here because there are no off-ramps. There are no opportunities to go around in as efficient and as effective a way as possible. As Ed mentioned, one user spent millions of dollars to reroute cargo that was necessary because they didn't have access to the efficiency and the safety and the security of the waterway for a period of time. Multiply that by over the 25,000 miles of navigable channel across the United States, and you can just begin to see some of those impacts. So approaching the governance of the inland waterway from the shared perspective is necessary. It's really fundamental to our ability to succeed. Here in the inland waterway, or in the upper Mississippi River and the inland river system specifically, one of the methodologies that we use for that shared governance is something we call the Waterway Action Plan, or a waterway action exists for all portions of the inland river system. And really it sets up that shared governance framework to pre-establish the communications and pre-establish some of those thresholds and discussions. Just like Ed and Courtney mentioned with regard to those trigger elevations, or those trigger gauges that relate to possible closures or impacts to the operation of a lock and dam, for example, or perhaps even impact to bridges, impact to bridges and the availability of the navigable channel under certain circumstances, whether it be high water or low water. And that Waterway Action Plan really sets up the opportunity for us to pre-vet some of those conversations, pre-vet some of those operational risk needs for the circumstances that we're experiencing. And I guess finally, Ed and Courtney also highlighted, I love the fact that this panel does that for us here, the need for communications. So the shared governance model kind of requires communications. The WAP, or the Waterway Action Plan, sets up our ability and kind of preloads some of those communications. It establishes that framework, but then maintaining those communications is imperative and integral to understanding the needs of our port community, the needs of the maritime industry, the other regulators, the other compliance folks, the state and local officials that also have a role depending on the circumstances that we're facing. Ed mentioned almost daily communications. during the flood of 2019, we were literally in daily communications with our industry groups. The River Industry Action Committee here in St. Louis and up throughout the upper Mississippi River, IRCA, which is our Illinois River Carriers Association Action Committee or group, as well as the Missouri River component, and communicating with those stakeholders on a nearly daily basis to discuss what our observations were, what we were experiencing, were there additional risk requirements or risk mitigations that needed to be put in place so that we then could operate as soon as the environment was going to allow us to do that.
So Captain Stormer, that actually is interesting. We just heard from Ed and Courtney about that relationship and how they were working together. And for a lot of us, we're thinking that's something really unique because we don't always hear about that level of coordination. And you've just mentioned that that's really part of your strategic plan as far as that shared government communication, that's in place on a daily basis. So that's fantastic. All right. So we thank you for your service and your leadership. You've supported the St. Louis region and your sector during some really challenging times that have included the longest lasting flood conditions on record. Ed and Courtney briefly mentioned COVID. With the COVID pandemic, it's created a new and unanticipated supply chain disruption. Can you talk about how the COVID pandemic has changed the Coast Guard, the inland waterway system at any level, whether it's safety, security, operations, any best practices that you'd like to share with the barge and fleeting industry that they could take that into consideration?
Sure. A great question, given our current circumstances. As we work through, strange and unique and dynamic times across the transportation industry, whether that's on the road or in the air, obviously, or here in the waterways. I'll talk about the Coast Guard's perspective and what the Coast Guard's doing first, and then speak a little bit to our engagement with industry on the matter. So from the Coast Guard's perspective, I'm really proud to say that the Coast Guard is well equipped. We have a long-standing history, hundreds of years of history of dealing with really ambiguous and strange and challenging and unknown circumstances. And this time is really no different. The men and women here in Sector Upper Mississippi River we're open for business, and we've been conducting missions since the implementation of some of these requirements and some of these restrictions related to COVID. Very proud of the work that they're doing. We're doing it a little differently. Like many folks, we've enacted work from home or work remotely requirements and opportunities, stretching our technology to allow us to conduct virtual meetings and virtual engagements with industry partners and our stakeholders. And I'm really pleased to say that to date, we haven't had a Coast Guard member here in Sector Upper Mississippi River that's been diagnosed or infected with COVID to date. Really a testament to their work and their responsibility in taking care of themselves. I mean, my guiding principles or guiding philosophy to them has been, we're going to do everything we can to take care of them and their families, and then get the mission done as well, incorporating some of those changes to work and to requirements. So really proud of the work that they have done and appreciate that. And we'll stay at it even as we work now through discussions about recovery as states and municipalities and places begin to reopen, and what that's going to mean for our workforce as we modify and adapt our work going forward. With regard to industry, with regard to industry and COVID, industry similarly has responded exceptionally. We wouldn't expect anything different. We're working with a region of professionals that really also respond in a resilient and adaptive way to the circumstances that this system throws at them, whatever those things are. Have been impressed with the way industry has modified their safety plans and implemented new safety requirements, both in the fleeting and in the transportation facets of the industry here, to really deal with some of the circumstances that come across or have arisen because of COVID. A great example is we've had 2 cases in which our engagement with industry has facilitated timely testing of individuals whom they believed might have been symptomatic on board their boats, really appropriate risk measures to to deal with the identification of any potential positive cases, and then the requirements that need to be implemented to ensure that they're able to keep the rest of their crews safe and then keep operating in a safe manner. From the Coast Guard's perspective, we're really focused on the safety of the vessels themselves, and in this case, that relates to the manning. So obviously, if COVID was going to impact the manning, the safe manning of any of the towboats operating in the inland river system, then the Coast Guard's going to be involved from that perspective, ensuring that the vessels remain adequately and safely manned. But then the additional part that we play, which isn't necessarily a Coast Guard governance or Coast Guard regulatory role, is just that engagement with the local community, the state, or the county, or whoever might otherwise need to be involved from a public health perspective, to ensure that we're able to work with all involved and collaborate to find the best possible solution for whatever the risks might be in that particular case.
Okay, we're going to turn to Deputy Commander Mick Scott. On behalf of the St. Louis region, we look forward to working with you in your new position. Your biography includes numerous Coast Guard awards for your leadership and your current responsibilities in the St. Louis region, which include maritime safety, security, and environmental protection of over 2,200 miles of waterway. Moving forward with your new responsibilities, what are your top 2 to 3 priorities that support shippers and carriers and their ability to transport freight safely and cost effectively?
Yeah, so the priorities or the kind of the initiatives, really, I think they boil down really to 2 areas, and the first is communication, and the second is operational flexibility. And communication it's such a simple concept, and often so hard to execute. But I haven't found that to be the case here. Prior to my arrival in 2018 as the deputy, I like Captain Stormer had never served on the inland rivers prior to this assignment, and I was given some really good advice, and it sounds cliche, borderline corny even, but when I asked someone who had served successfully here, what do I read? How do I prepare? And I had done the research and learned that the Waterway Action Plan was a thing that exists. And the gentleman laughed and he kind of scoffed and he told me, you got plenty of time for that. Read a little book that was written in 1883 called Life on the Mississippi. So I did, and pleasantly, in my time here, I found that kind of the culture, the fabric, the DNA of these rivers, of the people who have grown up, whether they're first, second, 8th, 10th generation on these rivers. The Waterway Action Plan, it just formalizes, those decades or centuries of hard lessons learned on how to operate, how to succeed, and how not to fail. And I feel like that's all rooted in communication and teamwork and a little bit of give and take along the way. Last summer we've talked about the floods from last summer, and there were a couple opportunities where I was acting sector commander, and one of them was during the decision to reopen St. Louis Harbor after its second closure, and how do we do that, and how did we do that safely? And we went in clear violation of words that were written in the Waterway Action Plan, but not the spirit. And I feel like that was only able to be achieved through really, really good, some hard conversations, but some good and some rich conversations with Waterway, with Waterway. With the industry, with the Army Corps, folks who realize, that for instance, things like Z-drive technologies on towboats give us, better maneuverability. So, we had realized that after the amount of days that the port was closed, the millions of dollars in revenue that was lost, even if some of these windows to operate were only going to be measured in, days or in cases, hours, when it was daytime restrictions only based on horsepower restrictions and all kinds of things, it was worth it. it was the right thing to do. And I feel like those successes were almost entirely a function of communication. And, the footnote to that is, it's been very, made very clear to me by the industry chairs and to some extent, individual towboat operators or crewmen who, we have the opportunity to speak with. It hasn't always been that way. To get to a lot of this positive communication, I mean, that's a work in progress that spans a number of years, and I'm the beneficiary of that, and many of us who are on this panel today are the beneficiary of that. But is certainly, I have an obligation to do my dead level best to not only keep that going, but obviously to improve it, because there's always room for improvement, and we got to figure out how to do that. And the second piece is operational flexibility, and I'll give a couple of examples of what I mean when I say that. For a lot of years, this captain of the port zone has had 5 inland river tenders, all in the same home ports. There really hasn't been movement for 20 something 30 years there. This next summer, we're going to be moving the Coast Guard cutter Gasconade from Omaha, Nebraska to St. Louis, Missouri, and there certainly is going to be some benefit to that, on the Kaskaskia, but across the river system. I know that I'm speaking to an audience who knows a lot of this, but generally speaking, when we're talking about the class of cutter like our inland river tenders, we're talking about a class of cutter that was designed for 20, 30 years of service, and in the next 2-3 years, those cutters that we have are going to be celebrating their 60th birthdays, and I'm extraordinarily confident that 10 to 12 years from now, we're really, really in good shape along this river system. The Coast Guard is doing unprecedented, has got some unprecedented works in the progress right now to recapitalize most of its cutter fleet, but part of that is the commerce cutter. But it might be upwards of 10 years before it's out. So we have to stretch the legs on what we have for a couple of more years until we get that, bigger, faster, stronger, more highly capable class of cutter on our river system. So whereas generally you're used to seeing the Coast Guard cutter Cheyenne, when we're talking about a 60-year-old cutter, we really have done well recently with it, but I can't rely that it's going to necessarily be fully mission capable, when the windows to operate, are there. So having a second cutter, kind of at arm's length is one example of that operational flexibility that really empowers me to support the Coast Guard's component of the industry. The second piece is, leveraging what we can out of technology. EAIS, virtual ATON, whatever you want to call that. We really kicked the tires on that last year, mostly because the timing was right, and secondly, out of necessity. When we had high water for in some specific areas for 70 and 80 days at a shot, with very little window to set buoys, or it just wouldn't have been appropriate. They would have been set and swept away, in matters of hours or days. We learned some lessons on how to use EATON to as a force multiplier in our constellation, and we didn't do it all entirely right. We've learned some lessons. We've gotten some really good feedback from industry, but by and large, it seems like if it's not a success story yet, it's destined to be a success story as we continue to learn more. So those are the two pieces of operational flexibility that I can really specifically address right now. But there are certainly others out there, and relying on feedback from industry to help us get there as well.
Very good. So focusing on your comments about communication, our audience today includes barge and towboat owners and operators, fleeting and harbor service companies, You work closely with this industry in a collaborative atmosphere. Do you have any requests or updates you would like to share with them? We plan on sharing all of this information from today with the industry trade publication. So do you have any messages, special requests, or anything you'd like to say to that audience?
Yeah, I do. I'm kind of blessed by this opportunity to kind of get, so many folks in one audience. So thank you again for that. I'm not going to add a whole lot more because if I do that, I'm honestly quite frankly speaking some of the same exact words that Captain Stormer has said already. I think what I'll do is I'll share just a little bit of insight on how sector leadership operates in the Coast Guard, kind of that prevailing way forward, because that may be not very commonly known. The sector commander really is the kind of the external face of the Coast Guard, and certainly of the sector in the captain of the port zone that he or she is charged with. And the deputy is a little bit more behind the scenes and generally kind of calling some of those internal shots. But it's important to know that any decision of real significance, any decision that really matters and is going to have legs that last are made collaboratively. So I say that to say, most of the decisions, most of the announcements, most of the kind of way forward that you've heard communicated by Captain Stormer over the last 2 or 3 years, I've had a voice in those. In a lot of cases, of course, I was learning through that process, but that's a long-winded way of saying not big changes in terms of philosophy or delivery of service. I feel like it's mostly right. Of course, we can get better. So if I'm going to do anything with this platform or this opportunity right now, it's to say this. I've met and I have a relationship already with many folks. For those folks, I want to further enrich that relationship, and with the folks who I'm a strange name to, I ask that you introduce yourself. I have office hours that are anytime. I'm always available, and it's important to me to establish those pre-need relationships, make them as rich and robust as possible, and really my offer, more so than hosting you in my not that terribly exciting office, would be the opportunity to visit you where you are, to meet your folks, to see the assets and toys that you use in your daily jobs, and to understand what your challenges are, to understand the recommendations, so that way when we do, and it's not if, but when we have some of those hard conversations, the only thing we have to talk about is the way forward, because the trust is already developed.
Alrighty, well, thank you. I can confidently say that Captain Stormer is leaving us in good hands. Ed Walbacher, you represent the region's 5 and almost 6 public ports. Do you have a question for Scott or Mick on behalf of the public ports?
Yeah, we're, it's the spring season. It's time for us to get people out on the river. And one of the things that we typically have done is the buoy set for the navigation channel to make sure they're in place at the proper locations. And I know it's jointly done with the Corps. What are the plans for this year, particularly maybe with the COVID, trying to get those out there in a timely fashion?
Sure, Ed. Thanks for the question. Really excited to be able to say and pleased of the work that's been done by our WLR crews, that we've been out for our spring runs. The constellation of 8's navigation from New Orleans to Minneapolis, St. Paul is set and ready for operation. We've been out multiple times in most sections of the river up here north of St. Louis, north of Chester. That includes the Illinois River, and we're working on our spring runs for the lower Missouri as well. So really pleased to say that the floating AIDS navigation constellation is in really great shape right now, and we're going to maintain what we would call a normal pace of operations for AIDS navigation. Know that we are still working on the recovery and the repair of much of the damage from the flood of 2019. As you have probably heard from your port partners and your industry partners, many of the shoreside AIDS navigation were decimated or completely destroyed as a function of that flood and the length of that flood. That's going to take us a little bit longer to repair and to reconstitute those fixed shoreside AIDS navigation. But I would encourage everyone to stay connected with the Coast Guard's broadcast notice to mariners and our Army Corps of Engineers partners, because as Mick highlighted, we're publishing and broadcasting electronic or virtual aids as well as marine safety information in real time now as challenges arise based on shoaling or dredging and those kinds of projects that need to be accomplished here. As well as we're also publishing to our industry groups, and we're happy to get people added to those distribution lists, but we're also publishing a monthly AIDS navigation summary, which is a little new for sector upper Mississippi River, that broadcasts what we've accomplished over the last month with regards to our AIDS navigation runs operationally, as well as some things that we're looking for in the future. And we're sending that out to the industry chairman.
Scott or Mick, do you have any questions for Ed or Courtney?
Questions? Not offhand. Really as much as anything, just appreciate the approach that we saw last year. Extraordinarily impressive, whether it's, gone down into the Army Corps' war room and watching how flood control was negotiated. It seemed like there actually is a crystal ball and it's located, I believe, with the Army Corps. But I don't have questions at this very moment, but certainly, again, I appreciate the open invitation and the opportunity to serve with you.
All right. Well, very good. All right. We're going to wrap this up, and we're going to wrap it up with 30 seconds for final comments. Ed, we're going to start with you. Any final closing comments?
I do appreciate everybody's participation today. They predicted another flood this year, and have high water, and we're hoping that it doesn't get over that level. Over the winter, we had dredging take place at the Kaskaskia. We had to delay that dredging several times because the water was so high. And our dredging contractor said he's never dredged in February. And that's scheduled to be done in November. So hopefully we can get through this season without having a closure of any length of time. That's what we got to look forward. We got to hope that happens. Thank you.
All right. Very good. Courtney, any remaining comments or closing comments?
Yes. Again, thank you for including me on this today. I would briefly like to highlight it has been flooding seasons, it seems like. 3 record-setting floods since 2016. So 3 record floods in 4 years. At Kaskaskia, we have made a number of improvements as we make our repairs, with the focus being, as we repair these items, how can we recover quicker and do a better job in the next event? And I guess, fortunately or unfortunately, we've been able to test ourselves almost every 18 months is what we're doing, helping. And it is from a funding standpoint on repairs, what we're spending each time, as well as recovery and opening at a quicker rate. So, as the nation comes to a point where things reopen, folks are able to come back into our facility. If it's a member of the public, if it's industry that has questions about what are we doing to be more reliable, I would put out an invite to, give me a call, come down and see us. I'm proud of the work that we've accomplished in the last 3 years to make our site more reliable. And I'd be happy to show that to anyone who takes an interest in it.
All right, very good. Captain Stormer, closing comments?
Sure, Mary, thanks. I as well will just say thank you for our opportunity to participate today, my opportunity to participate today, and as much so my opportunity to be a part of this port community for the last 3 years. Really appreciated it. And I don't want to speak for Mick, but I'm going to speak for Mick, which is the same standing invitation there at Kaskaskia applies to us. We're happy to showcase everything that we do here at the sector for both in the office here in the federal building in St. Louis, as well as at our facility down at the Arsenal Street Army Corps of Engineers Industrial Base. So we would look forward to hosting our port partners and community there. And once again, thanks very much.
Hey, Commander Mick Scott, final comments?
Yeah. Thanks, Mary. Yeah, that invitation is a solid one. So, Captain, I appreciate those words there. And beyond that, May 27th is our formal change of command. Ordinarily, that's a public event, and 200 or 250 folks kind of tend to show, and that's going to be a subdued ceremony this year. It's not going to be open. That said, we will be producing a video and a few letters that will go out, and we'll make sure that you're a part of the distribution for that. It does, it notes the day, but maybe more specifically also kind of speaks a little bit to the way forward and recognizes the past as well. So again, thank you for the opportunity to participate today, and look forward to continuing the engagement moving forward.
Well, very good. Thank you to all of you. So that concludes our panel discussion. We want to thank our 4 panelists for your leadership in supporting the inland waterway system and your efforts to advance this industry. FreightWeekSTL is an annual event that brings industry leaders together, and your comments regarding the COVID pandemic, your collaboration with working with shippers and carriers, and your commitment to the industry is very much appreciated. So thank you again for your ideas and innovation that are helping shape the future of freight. We encourage our audience to stay tuned for remaining FreightWeekSTL 2020 events. That includes a discussion with JLL David Branding. He's a national and regional industry leader. He will share his perspective of the industrial real estate market. And then we also plan on releasing the St. Louis Regional 2021 priority project list and the 2020 spring industrial real estate newsletter. So thanks again. Take care.